Okay, everybody, just a quick reminder that on Thursday, we will be going over urban forestry. And so you can read up on chapter 14. And I would recommend that you get started on your reading of chapter 15 and 16 and make sure that you go through all of your terminology, go through all of your chapter questions, and highlight the ones that you want to discuss. And even if it's just like, hey, this is how I thought about this, like, is this right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a question. But that's, as Graham said, last Thursday, those last two sessions next week are going to be a different format than what we've been doing. So
Yeah.
that's all I have to say, Graham.
Good. Okay. And with that in mind, today's presentation is going to be a little the opposite, where the PowerPoint that I have together here is not quite as centered around the ISA study guide. We'll be using a lot of similar terminology, but the narrative doesn't follow, the order that the book puts the concepts out to you in, or anything like that. So please, along the way, if there's some terminology from the book that we're not addressing at all, or you need some clarification on, chime in. Chrissy will be watching the chat, and we can do that as we go. But this is a good talk. I love giving it. This down below here, if I can move my, there we go, move my bar over. Is that blocking the screen share? Great.
No.
I don't know why that happens sometimes and not others. But down below here in the bottom, Urban Tree Risk Management, a Community Guide to Program Design and Implementation. That is a U.S. Forest Service document that I'm almost positive there are PDFs for online. Maybe Chrissy could double check that really quick and throw a link in the chat if you can find it. But it is a really nice manual that's put together. Of course, ISA also has their tree risk assessment qualification. That's a credential you can go after that gets into greater depth on how we assess and manage risk in trees and what the format for that is. And I think we'll be taking a look at the track sheets that ISA has put together for that.
The link is in the chat on that website page. Big green button that says download publication.
Perfect. If anybody is interested in that tree risk assessment qualification and you and I haven't spoken about it in the past, definitely either shoot me an email or put something in the chat about that, because I'm considering bringing a tree risk assessment qualification training to Nebraska this coming spring, probably mid to late spring. There is already a course being offered in Grinnell, Iowa, about 3 hours east of Omaha, but that's still quite a ways for most of the state. And so I'm kind of conflicted on whether that would be two conflicting events that neither would get as good of attendance for, or if we definitely have the critical mass to put that on. So there's some of you in attending today already that I know are interested in that, but if you and I haven't talked about it, make sure and shoot a note so I get you on my radar.
I believe you have to be a ISA certified arborist for 1 year minimum to be able to attend the course or to sign up, register for the course.
And they have accepted the NAA certification as well. So
okay,
that works as a requirement for that. The difference between a qualification and a certification is that with a certification, you test over the initial base knowledge, and then you get continuing education to keep that up. With a qualification, what you're doing is revisiting the same material periodically. So it's kind of splitting hairs, but it's worth distinguishing those two. So with track, you take the initial training for 2 days. On the morning of the third day, you do a test that takes an hour or two. And then within the next 5 years, you would retake a renewal for it. That's not as long or as expensive, but it's just going to revisit the same material to make sure that you have the process down well, as opposed to just supplementing it with new continuing education. So hopefully that makes sense. So I will take a look at the chat when we're done and get anybody that's interested in that on my short list. So let's do this. As I said, the manual that Chrissy linked to is sort of the framework for this talk. So we're going to follow basically how that document flows. The outline, we're going to talk a little bit about philosophy for a handful of slides. Then we'll get into the 7 categories of defects that the USDA Forest Service manual covers. For each of those defects, we'll define them, talk about some of the causes, symptoms, and some of those red flags that show a real high risk of failure for that particular defect. And then at the end, we'll talk about managing and prevention of these defects. So as I've mentioned a number of times, I hate to hammer a cliche too hard, but it's always better to do something right the first time than to come back and try to address it later. There's so many things that happen with trees that the response to a problem is much less effective than just doing your best to prevent those problems in the first place. And as Mariana pointed out last week, this notion that trees don't die when they're killed, this PowerPoint is really all about that. So if we plant trees properly and maintain them well, they're going to get bigger faster. They're going to be less susceptible to insect and disease problems. They're going to need less maintenance, like we mentioned with pruning last week. If we can establish good structure in a tree, then with a lot less labor, we can get good structure instead of trying to get okay structure out of trees and respond to storm damage and that sort of thing that's going to be potentially a compromise to the tree's structural integrity. And of course, number 6 there, we can maximize the benefits that trees provide, which is obviously the goal that we're all trying to accomplish. So here's a good side-by-side that the manual puts together on two trees with similar structure, one of them being addressed properly and the other not so much, and how that sort of plays out over time. And if we guide that structure of the tree, then we can have a much more desirable form that's less likely to have failures. Less likely being the key. We can't really eliminate risk in any tree. When we're talking about trees in the city, as we've mentioned in a couple different, it's hard for these presentations and these concepts to not bleed into each other a little bit. There's always going to be a little overlap. But there's lots of different stresses that trees are under in the city that's not necessarily at play when they're out in their natural context. The weather changing, too much water, too little water, the soil compaction, on and on and on. These are all things that trees have to deal with in the city that makes them perform less than ideally and potentially exposes the tree to a defect that can develop into a risk factor. Out of those, there's really only 2 that we can't do anything about. The weather related ones, if no rain's falling from the sky, I mean, we can supplementally water them, but we can't do anything about the drought itself. As temperatures fluctuate, that's also something that we can't do much about, especially in an intensely urban environment where we have lots of reflected heat from glass and concrete that makes those temperature fluctuations even worse. If we're planting trees that are marginally hardy, they're going to snap out of dormancy earlier when we have lots of that extra heat from city environments. And that can be really stressful, if not fatal to trees sometimes. But all these other ones we can do something about. That's where the management and the proper implementation on the front end makes such a huge difference. So out of those factors that we can influence, to me, mechanical damage, planting depth, and poor pruning are really the major ones that are driving failure for trees in urban settings. They're all valid, they're all important. chemical injury is certainly becoming a bigger deal with the agricultural drift that we're seeing in a lot of trees, the dicamba formulations in particular, but as adjacent property owners are managing their own plants in their own way, that has implications for drift settling on trees that may or may not be very tolerant of dealing with those smaller quantities of herbicide in most cases that can be an issue. So if we can avoid the mechanical damage to trees with smart design and plant trees at the proper depth and in the proper way in general, but depth being amongst planting practices, the real driver for success or failure, and then just doing well by the pruning that they need, like we talked about last week. Those are the three that I see at the top of my list. In your own community, you may see different factors being a bigger issue for you. That these aren't right or wrong answers here, just those three in red resonate the most with me for their implications for condition of trees. It can be hard to identify the stress that's causing problems. And oftentimes what some people refer to as plant health care is actually just addressing symptoms of stress and not really getting to the root of the problem and doing some problem solving at the landscape level. If you're only looking at the tree itself, then you're missing a lot of the picture. And so true plant health care involves not only identifying the symptoms that are concerning, that's usually why the phone rings in the first place, because the homeowner or the property manager says, hey, this tree, it looks bad. But the reason it looks bad is often not real obvious. And so it's important that we put our critical thinking caps on when we see the symptoms and figure out what's causing the symptom. Sometimes it's real cut and dry. You got bagworms all over your arborvitaes. Then if you want to get rid of the bagworms, you're gonna have to pick them off if you can or spray them if you can't reach them all. It's not usually some form of stress that makes trees succumb to a bagworm infestation. It's just bagworms coming in, establishing a foothold and building a population that doesn't get addressed. But other times there's lots of other factors that are making a tree more likely to get an insect or disease problem or some mechanical damage that's stressing the tree. So it's really important that we do our best to identify those underlying causes and then create a management strategy that minimizes that stress instead of, like I said earlier, just putting together a program that addresses the symptoms that are being seen. So lots of this stuff's fixable. Preventable is ideal, but we can mitigate some of these problems sometimes as well. So a quick exercise, we saw this tree in a previous PowerPoint. When was this tree killed? If somebody could unmute themselves and give me their feedback. Again, this is just discussion. There's no right or wrong answers. It's a thought exercise. What's going on with this tree and when was it killed? Obviously it died when it snapped at the ground level like this and fell over. It's done now. But when was it killed?
When it was planted.
Sorry?
When it was planted, it looks like it could have been planted too deep and no good cover.
Right. Yeah, that's possible. Very good. Anybody else?
Looks a little overwatered to me.
Overwatered, right?
Looks
Any
like
other
it
thoughts?
also has more damage, or the bark is all stripped off around the base.
Right. And those are all great thoughts. And what I'd add to it is rather than a root flare, we have a root taper. The tree's getting narrower as it goes into the ground, right? That's not very structurally sound. So you could argue that the tree was killed when it was grown in the nursery. It was predisposed to have a stem girdling root on it that killed the tree because it was never addressed. So there, no right or wrong answers here. There's a continuum. These are all factors that are playing into the tree ultimately failing. You could also talk about the fertilizer going on the grass that's stimulating the top to grow faster and get bigger and heavier and longer, and that could push the the date of failure earlier than if the tree was not getting stimulated by fertilizer. We don't have all the information that we need, but there's lots of possibilities on when this tree was actually killed. But when they get narrower at the base like that, it's obvious sign of a stem girdling root somewhere, especially when you get this kind of smooth bark here that was likely smashed against a root that the tree was growing. How about this one? When was this tree killed? This might not be as far back in time. We can't necessarily trace this back to poor nursery practices necessarily, but the tree was limbed up excessively. It could have a pretty limited soil volume to root out into, causing some issues with it staying upright. There could have been a weather event that saturated the soil and predisposed it to fail, so it could have been killed fairly recently by just a real drenching weather event that got the soils in just the wrong situation for this tree. So it's never just one thing. There's always multiple factors at play. And that's why it's so important that we play detective with the landscape when we're seeing a problem or a potential problem, and think about not only what's at play right now, but what could potentially happen to the tree down the road. We don't want to get in a situation where we're always concerned about a tree failing because of a rain event. There's not much we can do about that, but we can extrapolate out and think about what might happen if such an event happened. When were these trees killed, right? When it was planted so close to the house, that might have been when it was killed. When a new homeowner bought this house and decided they didn't want a big tree there, they could have killed it by just topping it out. So no rights or wrongs, but this is interesting discussion to think about in your own head as you're out and about in the properties that you manage. Live crown ratio. Do we even need to go there? Here on the left side, we have maybe about a 10% live crown ratio. If we look at the whole height of the tree and how much of it has live foliage, that's a no-go. That's not going to be anything good in the long term. And this is somebody that just really needs to plant a new tree. Nothing good's going to come from a tree growing at a lean like this that needs this material rigidly in place in order to just keep it from tipping further over. So interesting stuff. In the city, trees average about 7 to 20 years. That doesn't mean that we don't have trees that live 60, 70, 80 years, but we also have a whole lot of trees that die in their first 5 to 7 years, and that skews the averages. The same way we talk about our Neanderthal ancestors having a shorter average lifespan. It's not because there weren't cavemen that lived to 60, 70 years, but just there was a lot of infant mortality as well. So we don't get a lot of life out of the average tree in the city so that they can get to a proportion where they're giving us a lot of shade and benefits. So we need to be aware of all these stress factors so we can mitigate them as best we can, maximize their usable life for our clients. So in these two situations, which one is more a recipe for disaster and which is going to be conducive to tree growth? On the left-hand side, we have trees planted as individuals in really beautiful, lush turf grass that's getting a lot of inputs and maintenance. The chance for mechanical damage to the base of these trees is higher. They're getting watered more than they probably want to be, fertilized more often than they want to be. A lot of things counting against the trees on the left-hand side. On the right, we have trees planted in groups where they're mulched together and they can interlock their canopies. The irrigation can be put on the edge of this bed and doing what it needs to for the turf grass and not overwatering the trees as much as it would on the left-hand side. I have had people point out in the past that these pines on the right-hand side are probably going to crowd each other and reduce the air circulation. So there's a little bit more potential for foliage disease on those conifers over time. That might be a downside to planting them in proximity. But again, they're adapted to that sort of context where we find them in nature. So they may not be beautiful Christmas trees all the way from the top to bottom. They're going to have branches that die back over time, getting shaded out. They'll still probably do pretty well. As we talked about with pruning, defects like bark inclusion and poor structure are preventable. And so the better we get at reading the body language of trees, identifying those red flags, and intervening early, then we can minimize the chance of these sort of failures happening. Same here. When was this tree killed? When it was planted under a power line with a mature size that was going to be in conflict with that power line, likely. It's not the utility companies that kill these trees. They are preserving the integrity of the electrical utility so that everybody keeps their power on, and at the same time allowing the homeowner to keep that tree that they planted in the wrong spot. So I don't defend individual pruning jobs, but I will defend the utility companies that often get a really bad rap as tree butchers, when in fact they're leaving a tree that shouldn't have been planted there in the first place. In a lot of cases, it's sort of a public relations issue where the utility doesn't want to be seen as people cutting everybody's trees down when they do have an easement and the legal ability to do so. And what's left behind, often they get a bad rap for, and it's uncalled for in a lot of cases. This is just a funny picture as far as management goes. People get a lot of crazy ideas on the best way to approach things, and it's just a good one for a chuckle and an idea of just how crazy people can get when they want to manage things a certain way. So it's worth mentioning that all trees will fail. Any branch or the whole tree itself can fail if the loads exceed the strength of the wood. And it's kind of a no-brainer statement, but it's really worth saying that way because we get caught up in defects that we can identify when there are sometimes defects that we can't see very easily. And so it's worth considering that all trees have the potential to fail if the wind gets strong enough, if the ice load gets heavy enough. It's just a piece of wood like anything else. So the same way a house can blow over with sufficient forces, the same is true for trees. Defective trees will simply fail more. They're just more likely to fail, or they'll fail sooner than trees that have good structure and form and are growing sound. So we can predict a lot of failures when defects are visible and obvious. And as arborists, it's important that we expand the types of defects that we can identify well as much as possible so that less is escaping our perception and a defect that goes unnoticed. But things like this are real obvious to most people, and it's usually why the phone call rings for you in the first place. So let's get into the meat of the content here. Disclaimer, as I said before, all trees are defective. They're living organisms. There is no such thing as a perfect tree without some sort of defect, whether it be large or small. You can't detect, correct, or eliminate all defects in trees. As I said just a minute ago, some of them are not going to be easy to identify, and so we have to treat all trees as if there are some potential defects. Now, that doesn't mean we have to be ruled by fear. The statistics make it far less likely for a person to be injured or killed by a tree than a lightning strike, for example, or somebody winning the lottery. These are very small numbers, but they're still real, and trees or people are very important, and their safety is really important. So it's difficult to strike a balance between a realistic management of risk and not being aggressive with taking out trees that have defects that we can see in them, because oftentimes there is a middle ground to mitigate those defects. The best thing that you can do is regularly inspect the trees that you manage. And that's the most important step in managing risk. If you're maybe you work for a small community and you're in charge of all the parks and the street trees, if you're just waiting for the phone to ring because a homeowner sees something that's concerning, then you're not doing much to mitigate risk. And more than likely, these defects are going to manifest and fail before you can intervene. So the proactive inspection and management is key to this whole process. Now, a hazard tree is different than a defective tree. A hazard tree has to have 3 factors in play. We have to see a defect that we know exists. We have to have an environment that predisposes that defect to fail, whether it's the tree with the stem girdling root at the base or a branch with a cavity in it. You know, we don't have to think of the whole tree as either failing or not. We can look at individual parts and decide whether a particular branch is likely to fail and look at and narrow the scope of what we're thinking of a little bit. And the third aspect is having an actual target that will be impacted by that failure, or at least have the potential to be impacted by it. That can be electrical lines, streets, picnic tables, infrastructure, people, cars. Those are all targets and they have different value. Obviously, it's not a big deal if a bus bench is crushed by a tree branch, but if a person is sitting at that bus bench when the branch fails, then we have a higher value target in that same location. I see the chat, Chrissy. Anything we want to talk about as we go? Just let me know.
Conversation about how like one specific event can really leave a long-lasting impact on people's perspectives, and of course not always good ones. Like
Right.
Anna has, like, you know, so many people in Iowa don't want to plant another tree after the derecho, if I even said that right, even though this was a one-time, like once in a lifetime event.
Right. The likelihood of that happening again may be fairly low, but it still sours people's taste sometimes for addressing it with another, you know, coming back with another tree.
Right.
And when Pilger had the tornado in 2014, it might have been 15, but I think it was 2014. When we came back with a tree planting effort to help that community, there were a handful of people that just they were okay without another tree in the front yard. And that's fine. There's no reason that everybody has to replace a tree. But you know, we have to have a pragmatic understanding of probabilities also, and that can really inform good decision making. So target occupancy, in other words, how frequently is the target in that location? The bus bench is always there. And if there's a tree with a branch with a defect in it that's likely to fail, when or if it fails, it's pretty likely to hit that bus bench. But the people that sit at that bus bench are not there all the time. And so the occupancy rate's going to change. It is a higher value target that's not there as frequently. So these are difficult things to weigh when we're deciding how to manage the tree properly. So the top left tree is defective. We do see bark sloughing off of it near the base, likely some decay. But as the context indicates, we don't have any high value targets or any targets other than trees in all likelihood with just the information we have in the photo. On the bottom right, however, we have a tree that's planted deep in the ground. On the right side, there's a couple decay cavities that might be of concern, needing to be monitored and evaluated a little more closely. But we certainly have some more high value targets, even if we just want to think of the parking lot itself. Cars can be replaced. The parking lot can be cleared again, but people and, you know, injury and loss of people is not replaceable and something that has to be considered. So we have a tree that's much more potentially hazardous in the bottom right compared to a tree that just has some defects, but very little implications for impacting high value targets. So here again, we have two trees that are potentially defective, how frequently is there a target in and around these trees is going to play into our thought process. How major of a road is the tree next to? Sometimes it's just a county road that people are not on very frequently, but ultimately, if it's adjacent to a street or a utility, or oftentimes both, then the constant occupancy rate of those targets has to be considered. Another disclaimer that's not listed here, I am not an attorney, so I can't speak to the legal nature of this conversation and this topic. But I do know that there is discussion in court cases about what is reasonable and prudent for tree managers to be doing. And what that means is that as an arborist that is asked to come look at a homeowner's property, what's reasonable and prudent for you to do when you're assessing trees for that property is a full walkthrough around each tree to identify warning signs, things that might need to be addressed, potential defects, and likelihood of failure. If you're managing an entire community, it is not reasonable or prudent or feasible to provide that level of assessment to every tree in your community. And that's a distinction that is not lost on the courts. So if a tragic event happens in your community involving a tree and somebody getting hurt or killed, or some substantial property loss, damages, things of that nature, what the judge is going to want to know is what steps were you taking to manage and monitor the trees in your community. And as I mentioned, that is, it's not reasonable to expect that every single tree in this photo in the bottom right is being inspected to the same degree that you might inspect a tree for a client as a tree service. I don't have the expertise to get into any greater depth on it than that without misspeaking potentially, but it's a distinction worth noting. And this doesn't let municipalities off the hook. It doesn't mean that you don't have to do as much. There's still lots of work to be done in managing and monitoring the trees throughout an entire community, but you're not going to necessarily be held to the same standard. And this is where inventories are really helpful. If you need to demonstrate to a court that you are monitoring your trees, an inventory is documentation of that monitoring. And so it can be a really important step in managing your legal liability for the trees that are in your city. So the manual, the USDA book on tree risk breaks defects up into 7 categories, and we're going to go through these one by one, as I mentioned in the outline earlier on. The first is decay, which obviously means wood that is rotten or missing. The wood is compromised by decay pathogens. Fungus is not able to make its own food the way that plants are, which is part of why we separate them into their own kingdom of life forms, separate from plants. Plants can photosynthesize and make energy from light and water and gases. But fungus organisms need to break down tissues to make food. And so through pruning wounds or injuries of other sorts, these pathogens are able to find entry into the tree and establish and take advantage of the starches and sugars and carbohydrates that the tree produces through photosynthesis. So the same way we've talked earlier on about how mycorrhizae is sort of a mutually beneficial relationship, with decay, we're talking about more of a parasitic relationship between a fungus and a living tree. So as that decay breaks down, the wood has less structural integrity and it's less likely to support the weight that it's going to continue to want to put on. Obviously, a tree like silver maple comes to mind here, where you can have a tree that's perfectly leafed out with lots of good foliage all over the place, and maybe very few visible warning signs of decay. But inside, as many, or if not most of you know, we can be really surprised with how little sound wood is in there. So if you see conchs, shelf fungi, mushrooms of any sort on a tree, there is decay in that tree. Now, you can have decay in a tree without the presence of the fruiting bodies, the mushrooms, but the other way around, if you have the visible symptoms of mushrooms growing on a tree, then there is no doubt about decay being present. The question is just to how extensive is it in the tree, and how much has that decay compromised the tree's structure. Sometimes insect infestations can make this, they can accelerate the decay process. There's more gas exchange and moisture inside this wood. And so decay, this is an even better environment for decay to set in and really do what it's good at. As I mentioned in pruning, decay moves most rapidly in trees up and down, both up and down. And looking at the four walls of Codit, this is maybe a little bit less of a concern for structural integrity than the decay spreading into the heartwood that's really providing that strength. But that decay is always an issue for how likely the tree is to fail, no matter what. What we're wondering at all times is, we know decay is in a tree. To what extent is it spread throughout? Oftentimes trees will create a barrier zone that is sort of delineating where the wound that has introduced decay into the tree is to stop. So in response to damage, trees will grow new wood that has a higher concentration of decay resistant compounds in it. And you might say, well, why doesn't the tree always grow wood that has all those compounds in it? Well, because it takes energy to do that. And so it's going to be judicious about how much energy it spends on growing wood with these extra compounds if they're not necessary. So the tree is always responding to the damage and not growing in a preventative way and putting a lot of energy into producing chemicals that are going to resist decay that it doesn't need to fight right away. This is in the woodworking world, this is often how spalt manifests in trees. If you see the sort of swirling of gray tones in wood that is really attractive, there will often be darker lines at the edge of that spalting, at the edge of that decay that's just in very early stages. And that's showing not only where the barrier zone is for that decay, but also sometimes where two different decay pathogens are meeting each other and choosing to form a boundary where you stay over here, over there, and I'll stay over here, and we'll both get the food that we need. So you can have multiple barrier zones. The strongest, the way that trees are best at preventing decay is by preventing decay in the wood that grows after the injury, because of that response and the compounds that are present in the wood that's responding to the damage. So mechanical injury often introduces decay into the tree in the first place. This can be why you see dieback in the top of the tree from mechanical damage at the base. There's some rules of thumb that I don't go into today in terms of the shell thickness. So the shell meaning how much sound wood do we have in place in proportion to the cavity that's left inside. So this will be a ratio that compares the diameter of the tree where the defect occurs and relates that to how much sound wood is in place. And so there are different rules of thumb depending on whether we have an enclosed shell, meaning we don't have a cavity that's visible and coming out to daylight, versus like in this case where we have an open shell where the cavity is visible and extends into the heartwood and is going to be less sound. So high risk of failure for decay if the shell is less than 1 inch for every 6 inches of stem diameter. So that 1:6 ratio tells us that we have a tree that's very likely to fail because of that defect. If we have an enclosed shell, then we can look at more like I'm sorry, I had that backwards. If it's open and the decay or the cavity daylights and we can see it, then we want at least 2 inches of good sound wood for every 6 inches of stem diameter. And if we have more than 30% of the circumference around the trunk impacted, that's also a sign that we really need to at least be monitoring that tree once to 2-3 times a year, if not doing some sort of actual mitigation, some pruning or something that's going to reduce the forces acting on that defect. Number 2 is cracks. These are often not really visible and they can hide themselves in the character of the bark with trees that have really thick and rough bark to them. Sometimes cracks aren't quite as obvious. We do distinguish between vertical and horizontal cracks because they have different implications for the tree. Sometimes the cracks just cause because a wound is not sealing over well, and so you have a path of least resistance for that force that acts on the tree from wind or what have you to continue to pull that wound open further than the wound itself caused. Sometimes this is from bark inclusion or poor pruning practices. Sometimes a tree will get twisted by the wind. When we think of straight line winds, they don't always act on the canopy equally on both sides. So sometimes if the tree canopy is uneven, then the tree will sort of get twisted by the wind and cause a crack to occur. Sometimes this can happen just on a single branch and not in the main stem of the tree. If you see daylight through a crack, particularly if it's bifurcating the tree, you have 2 codominant leaders that are similar in size and a crack originating from that, that is very likely to fail and probably not in a particularly long time span. If we're looking at a crack like this and there is a bit of breeze that day that you're visiting the tree, if you see the gap widening and closing again, then that movement is also an indicator of a failure being much more imminent than if the crack is kind of static and doesn't move as much. Horizontal cracks are even more a sign of failure and more a cause for concern, because that's showing that the tree is already starting to fail. This sort of thing needs to be looked at and monitored more closely. Now, I have seen trees exhibit bark like this because they had staking that was not removed earlier on in the tree's life. But generally, if you have horizontal cracks in a tree, that is a huge red flag, and you need to maybe intervene, but at least monitor the tree very frequently. But sometimes trees can respond to these cracks and they can seal them back up. As the diagram here shows, the annual growth rings can reestablish and be connected again across that wound that occurred earlier on in its life. And so this color change in the crack indicates that response wood. And the same way response wood is particularly good at stopping decay, it also often has more strength to it than wood that the tree's growing year after year, not in response to any wounding. The same way we can break a bone, and if the bone is set properly, sometimes we have a stronger bone that's responding to that wound that carries over into trees. Obviously, we have different processes going on entirely, but it does work in a similar way in terms of having more strength afterwards if the tree is able to address that wound well. So high risk of failure, any stem that's split in two and has a crack forming between those two codominant leaders. Any stem segment with lots of cracks in it and decay at the same time is very likely to fail. Cracked branches like we see here are likely to fail as well. Root problems, as we talked about, these are often harder to identify. Sometimes roots are cut off from putting in utilities like we talked about with construction impacts. They can be crushed sometimes if they're very close to the surface of the soil. They can have decay spreading through them just like a branch. There can be just a lack of root system because there's a physical barrier preventing the tree from establishing those wagon wheel spokes in all directions that give it stability. So yeah, we talked about a lot of this last week with construction protection. Some symptoms, you can see crown decline, branch dieback that can be caused by root issues. It's important to be able to distinguish whether a tree has always had a lean to it or if it is leaning more as time goes on, or if there's lots of earthwork that was done close by the tree that can often initiate trees starting to lean or showing that decline from the root loss. So again, revisiting construction protection, we have this critical root zone or critical root radius. This the drip line sort of determines that part of the ground where the really important part of the tree's root system is. And if we can quantify what percentage of that circle has been impacted or cut off or compacted, that gives us a good idea of how negative a response we should expect the tree to potentially show us. When we have over 40% of the base of the tree with a stem girdling root pressing against it, that's a definite sign that we need to be monitoring or intervening. It's usually pretty easy to take a root like this and very carefully cut through that root. We don't need to surgically remove the part of the root that has been cut off, because we'll just be more likely to damage other tissue. We really just need to relieve that tension and prevent that root from continuing to grow and get thicker. If you're concerned about a tree starting to lean, one thing you can do is install a static point like a T-post, or if there's already something that you can put a marking on, then you can come back periodically with some spray paint, put a marking on the tree and a marking on where you're going to measure, so you know you're measuring between 2 points that stay the same, and see whether that distance is increasing. As the picture shows, there can be heaving soil, roots becoming exposed if that tree is slowly failing over time from leaning over and maybe having the root system compromised. So high risk of failure for these root issues, if the tree is leaning with obvious evidence that that's a process instead of a lean that the tree has had for some amount of time. If we have more than 40% of that critical root zone damaged for a particular tree, and if we have substantial stem girdling roots, then that is limiting the tree's ability to flare at the base and give it structural stability. So back to the idea of high risk targets, the time of occupancy, this pine tree is probably failing a little over time. We don't have the obvious signs. We don't have real distinct mounding of the soil, lifting on the side, on the leaning side, but definitely targets that predispose this tree to really needing to be removed to take that liability and that chance of risk out of the picture. I can't think of any good pruning strategies that would give us a desirable form for this tree and reduce the forces that would predispose it to failure adequately. Weak branch unions, this is again a revisiting of some of the concepts we talked about with pruning. If trees are growing at really tight branch angles, we're going to have bark growing inside that attachment and preventing soundwood from giving the branch the stability and the strength that it needs to stay attached. At what height do trees commonly become codominant? This is a question I pose to you guys. There's a trend in where codominant stems tend to originate and how high off the ground that is. Anybody have any ideas, or do they know? Do you know?
I'll take a guess, and it's probably the height at which you can't reach with your pruning equipment from the ground.
Yeah, that's part of it, Kent. The other factor at play is the height that branching started when the tree was planted. So if you don't have branches for the first 6 feet when a tree is planted, obviously you're not going to have codominance below that, because even if you've got some sprouts coming off the trunk, they're not likely to vie for dominance down the road if you have something, some dominance established already above. So between the limits of what a homeowner is able to address, as Kent pointed out, and the idea that you're not going to have codominance below where the tree was branching when it was bought from the nursery. Because nurseries are sort of guiding the tree's structure as they're grown as well. And so after it goes in the ground in its permanent location, that's when the codominance really starts. So strong branch unions look like U's instead of V's, and we will have a distinct branch bark ridge when there's sufficient room for both of these branches. Now we do still have codominance in this diagram, right? If we don't do something, both of these branches are going to grow at a similar rate, and eventually we could have bark inclusion in here in a number of years down the road. So just because we see used now and sufficient room doesn't mean that that can't change over time. But in terms of evaluating the strength of a branch union at the time you're there visiting the tree, we want to see a good amount of room for both of these branches to continue to expand, and that will manifest that branch bark ridge where the bark of the two is meeting and sort of rising up a little bit. So weak unions is where we have this codominance and the bark is smashed together, and where the sound wood originates down here is not proportional to the size that those branches are going to continue to grow. And I love these diagrams for kind of showing where the annual rings actually diverge for stems like this. And you can sort of picture the structure of the tree earlier on and then see how that bark inclusion is continuing to create wood that's smashed up against the branch, but not really giving it a strong attachment. If we have decay in the tree, if we kind of stack different defects on with each other, if we know that decay is present in the tree, then we need to be skeptical of how strongly attached branches are that are adjacent to that decay, even if they have a good branch angle to them. So high likelihood of failure for branch attachments. If we have a weak union that's also cracked, cankered, again, if we're adding a weak attachment to other defects in this list, that's definitely a high risk of failure. And then if we're allowing large epicormic branches to form adjacent to decay, that's another recipe for disaster. Cankers are where we are seeing tissue in a tree that has, it's sort of like decay on the inside, but instead we have a problem in the living tissue. And sometimes I even see this coming right out of the nursery where a tree already has canker on it. Honey locust is an example in my own experience where I see trees coming out of the nursery trade sometimes with canker already present. My guess is that, honey locust is prone to have sprouts coming off the trunk. And as those are being cut off through the growing process in the nursery, that potentially that's where decay or canker and decay is being spread by, pruning shears or pruners that are not being sanitized periodically. So there's not enough wood to support the tree at the canker location. So this can be caused and introduced by insect feeding, disease problems, lightning strikes, any sort of physical damage to the tree can be an inroad for decay to spread. And sometimes the tree will respond with new bark growing over that area and kind of hiding the fact that there is a canker present there. Yeah, I kind of made this point already. Any kind of physical damage is a potential way for that canker to spread in. Oh, this is so cringy looking at this tree. This is the same tree from two different angles. We have a campground, high occupancy rate, at least during the growing season. And if we look at it from the side, not only do we have a significant amount of the circumference of the trunk impacted, but boy, it's spread way into the heartwood and very likely to fail. But most trees with canker are not going to be this bad. Obviously, we need to be more sensitive to identifying the trees that are way less compromised than this, so that we can monitor them and do whatever we need to potentially address and mitigate what could happen down the road. So if the canker is over 40% of the trunk circumference, if we have lots of decay, if we have codominance, the presence of other defects along with the canker, that's going to increase the likelihood of failure. Poor architecture, leaning trees. I don't see as much of this, but it is a problem and something worth noting. Cottonwood, of course, is our state tree. And as you know, cottonwood often grows from seed that's born in clumps. And so you can have multiple trees germinating from a fairly small piece of ground and then growing off in one direction or another to get that light that they need. And so whenever we have cottonwood in particular, or lots of other trees that can develop a lean to them because of their physiology or the way their seed is dispersed, what have you, then we're going to need to monitor those more closely. And some of you might remember the picture that I shared of Scenic Park in South Sioux City and a cottonwood that had fallen over on the playground equipment. So Scenic Park is right in the oxbow of the Missouri River, so it floods all the time. And when that flooding comes in and saturates the soil, it rots fine feeder roots. It compromises how well the soil keeps the tree anchored. And when those cottonwoods are growing at different angles and not just straight up and down like we tend to like and want trees to, then that's going to predispose it to fall over completely green in that case. So as this mentions, whenever we have other defects present along with a lean, that's compounding and making it more likely to be a problem. See signs down here at the base of this ash. Same here, we have potentially a split or at least a wound and canker setting in there.
Graham, your bandwidth is being stretched a little bit.
Okay.
Every now and then, just so you know.
Okay, thank you.
It's because you've totally gone robot on us.
Sorry, guys. So wood it's not equally strong when different forces are acting on it. Wood is much stronger under tension than it is under compression. So, and we see different signs. So if we see bulges, picture like, I don't know, picture whatever you want. But when you see these sort of rolls or ridges forming, that is a sign that the tree is buckling under its own weight to some degree. On the tension side, these are less frequent. They're harder to identify when the tree is having problems from tension. But if it's growing at this weird angle and we have a lot of tension on the wood on the outer side. That can be a horizontal crack that forms. Maybe the bark is starting to slough off from there. But the wood is much stronger under tension than it is under compression. So it's good to know the difference in how those symptoms manifest. So if you got a tree with a real excessive lean in conjunction with other defects, really likely that that's going to be a problem. If you have a leaning tree with a crack, that's going to fail. If you have a leaning tree with a horizontal crack and the bark sloughing off, that's very likely to be an imminent failure. Then the last defect is just dead trees, dead tops, dead branches, any dead wood that's present, whether it's an entire tree or just a part of the tree. Obviously, this is structurally unsound. It will have decay in it at some point and fail. There's not a lot of predictability to when these branches break out of the tree. Obviously, windstorms do a good job. That's Mother Nature's way of pruning dead wood out of trees periodically, but this dead wood can fail without there being any weather event to kick it off. So if we have dead wood that's a hanger, you know, we call these widow makers. Sometimes there's very little wood actually still connecting that branch is imminently going to drop out of that tree at some point. So what can we do about all this? As I mentioned earlier, tree risk inspections are a really important step in the process. The monitoring of these trees, periodic photography so that you can compare to how the tree was in the past is a really important tool for assessing defects. There's a handful of tools. Some of them are kind of pokey in nature. We have different kind of probes that can help us determine how deep a cavity is. We have increment bores that can take a core out of the tree and show us how much sound wood is present into the tree. It's also nice to have a tape that we can take measurements on the trunk and monitor how quickly it's continuing to grow. We can do the same thing with bundle scars and looking at the branches and how the growth rate of the tree is changing over time. There's also really fancy equipment. They're not pictured here, but there's a resistograph tool, which is basically a battery-powered drill with a printer attached to it that's going to give you a graph on how much resistance the drill bit is encountering as it moves further into the tree, which would then indicate where decay is present with a fairly minimal wound to the tree, although a wound nonetheless. If you want to do this without wounding the tree, there's a tool called a tomograph, and sonic tomography is where you have these fancy paddles that get strapped around the trunk of the tree at intervals, and then using sound, that sound is moving through the wood in the tree and getting picked up by the other paddles, and and then a bunch of fancy math that goes into determining where the sound wood is in the tree, and it gives you a visual kind of indicating what's likely to be going on inside the tree without having to drill into it. So when we're assessing trees, and again, I don't think ISA goes into this process much in the book, nor do they probably test over this procedure, because this goes into the tree risk assessment qualification. But there are some steps we can go through. We're going to identify a target, identify defective parts that we're concerned with, the likelihood of failure of that defect, and the likelihood of a failure of that defect impacting the target. And then finally, based on the value of the target that we're considering, what would be the consequences of all three of these things aligning and becoming a reality? So when you consider all of these first 5 considerations that can give you a basic risk rating for each defect. So here is the tree risk assessment form that ISA has put together. There are other systems out there. This is the only one that I can speak to. It's the only one that I'm trained on, but there are different systems that have been developed by other organizations as well. It's worth noting that. So in the form, we start with targets, not with defects. What are the targets at play in and around the tree? That doesn't have to be just 4. We can add another form if we have lots of targets. But we're going to identify the target. We're going to look at a couple different factors going on. How frequently is the target in that location where it could be impacted? As I mentioned earlier, we're going to do some detective work on the site. What's going on around the tree? Is it in a really windswept area, or is it more sheltered? Is it in saturated soil all the time, or is it in unirrigated ground? All these different factors are going to play in, and it's important to document these along the way, even if they aren't significantly changing your impressions about the risk of the tree. It's still important to document what you know is going on. And then we actually identify the defects that we're concerned with. Do we have an unbalanced crown? What's the history of the tree's management? Has it been lion-tailed? Has it had dead wood taken out of it in the past? This is both good and bad pruning history. We look at the trunk, the branches, the roots, and we consider all these parts of the trees separately. Once we've done all that, we've looked at the defects and we've looked at the targets, then we start to break down and prioritize the specifics of each defect and assigning a risk rating to that part that has a defect. So you'll notice that these numbers up here, or they're not numbers up here, these are qualitative instead of quantitative. So most homeowners or clients or general public, whoever you serve in your particular case, they're going to want some kind of percentage, and that's just not something that you can or should be providing. We can talk about how likely something is to fail, but what's really important here at the towards the top is this time frame. Okay, so we can talk all we want about what defects are in the tree and what targets there are, but unless we specify a time frame that we're making these considerations for, then all this information is worthless. Because if we haven't specified a time frame, then every defect is 100% likely to fail eventually. So we really have to identify what sort of time frame are we considering for this assessment. So that could be 1 year if we want to be really specific. And within a single year, any one defect is probably not going to be as likely to fail as if we cast our net wider and make that time frame 5 years. But we get to, eventually, if we get into 10, 20 years, it's less practical to consider a time frame that's that much longer when we should be revisiting more frequently if the tree has defects that are significant. So all this creates a matrix that we then arrive at actual risk ratings for each individual part. And then we can use those to give an overall risk rating for the tree itself. But it's still, to me, much more important to look at those risk ratings for the individual defects that have been identified. So hopefully that kind of whets your appetite a little bit for what the tree risk assessment training goes into and the process for it. I wouldn't encourage anybody to use this form without having the training, but it does sort of prompt the concepts and the process to you on what that looks like. So here's an example that was put together. We see a tree, you know, in this picture alone. What do we see that's of concern? What do you guys notice in this picture? Anything? You can say nothing. Maybe you don't see anything that's a red flag for you. Anybody?
Yourself.
What's that?
I said if anybody has something to say, go ahead and unmute yourself. I mean, right off the bat, Graham, like I see some discoloration in the soil.
Right. So maybe there's some sap bleeding from the tree.
Ooh.
You know, we don't know exactly what's going on.
Kurt
Also,
says that he thinks that he sees some frash.
right? Yeah. It's probably
Yes.
yeah, exactly. So probably some insect activity going on in there. Also some potential for some bark that's maybe not sloughed off the tree, but not actually attached to the cambium underneath.
So I'd want to take my soil probe and probe into all of that area that's kind of dark and discolored on the ground there, and just see if there's actually any root flare underneath that. If there isn't, then you've got some evidence of some rot at some point and somewhat of a potential problem there.
Yeah, that's great, Kent, and you really teed me up for the next slide really well. Now, sometimes we can have root flares in the area in between, you know, having the absence of a flare in between where there are some others may not be a sign for concern in and of itself, but that's all wonderful information. So let's do that. Let's go ahead and we're going to start to pull away some of the punky wood and bark that's inside of there. And now we see that we do have a significant decay cavity in the tree. And we haven't, you know, this looks kind of invasive, but we haven't taken away anything that's doing the tree much good by excavating this out a little bit. This is a tool, I don't know the name of it, and it has kind of limited application for these sort of purposes, but can be helpful. So then as we excavate further, we find that cavity moves all the way from one side to the other, and we can take our Biltmore stick or a yardstick and push it all the way through from one side to the other. So that's tells us that we have definitely a significant defect in the tree. Is it likely to fail? Within what time frame, right? So there's always variables that we need to be being more specific in order to give good information. So we don't know everything that we need to about the significance of the defect, because if we haven't identified a time frame that we're considering, then it's hard to give a likelihood of failure. Is this tree going to fail tomorrow? I would put a lot of money on it not failing tomorrow. But is it going to fail in 5 years, 10 years? You know, so again, it gets back to the time frame being really critical for all the information that you're giving. So now that tree's right here. So let's talk about targets. we got a playground. We have at least a little bit of dieback in the canopy telling us a little bit more about the state that the tree is in. So all these factors are playing into the risk rating that we ultimately assign to the tree. If this tree was just out in the middle of the forest somewhere, are we really going to spend a lot of time or money cutting it down or pruning it or doing something other than cutting it down? Probably not, because you need that presence of high value targets to make the risk worth mitigating. So that's kind of the thought process behind trees that we identify defects in, but we can also prevent defects in trees as well through examination and kind of staying on top of the overall health of the tree and the site conditions, estimating that potential for failure, and also just being smart about how we install landscapes. As we talked about in the slides early on, planting trees in groups, separating that turf tree interface in order to minimize mechanical damage the trees might be subjected to is really important. Good preventative measure, and also gives the trees the cultural requirements they need and the turf what it's going to need to continue to be green and lush.
John, did you have a question?
No.
All right. So this is kind of a reiteration of the same slide. If we look at these two landscapes, one of them is more likely to have problems, right? We haven't separated the turf from the trees very effectively, which isn't critical. having trees in the turf grass just makes them predisposed to problems that aren't very likely if we take them out of that turf grass scenario. But we can simplify management strategies by separating turf and trees and picking good locations for the trees and picking species and high quality nursery stock that's appropriate for where we're planting. So who wants to go mow these islands? Not me. Select trees that are native or at least adapted to our part of the country. This is where, I'm usually not really big on cultivars, but there are cases where we can select and buy trees from the nursery trade that have been selected for resistance to some of these diseases that can be a problem down the road. And that's a good thing. There are trees that are cultivars because they're hardier than the species itself. So cultivars aren't all bad, even though I tend to like to grow seed grown straight species most of the time. Then Pegsmore, I don't talk about this a lot, but it is kind of a good acronym to keep in mind. Pegsmore is a way of keeping all these different stages of growth in mind for the tree. You plant it, it's going to go through an establishment phase for a handful of years where it's kind of getting that root to shoot ratio established so that it's not imbalanced one way or the other. Then it's going to be in a growth stage where we're kind of guiding that structure of the tree. All the concepts I talked about with pruning kind of apply to these first couple stages. Once we have that permanent structure in the tree, then it eventually goes into a mature form. And then it starts to get overly mature. And this is where its processes are going to start to slow down. It needs less energy. It needs less water. Sometimes trees tend to actually shed branches in this phase, which is referred to as retrenchment. Retrenchment, as I understand, is actually a financial term initially, where as you approach retirement, you limit your liabilities in order to have a dependable nest egg to carry you through the rest of your years. And trees have a similar process. And here in the United States, we're not very tolerant of trees in that over-mature state where dieback starts to occur, even if it's totally natural and not caused by some sort of insect or disease problem. We tend to want to just cut those puppies down instead of allow them to not so gracefully take on a overly mature form, and eventually those trees get replaced. So that's Pegsmore, kind of helps you keep each of these growth stages in mind. And there's kind of a visual indication of each of those stages. Plant the right tree in the right place at the right way. Often that part gets left out. Usually you hear right tree, right place, but proper planting is really key in that as well. Not watering too much or too little, not piling mulch around the base. Again, these are all concepts that we've talked about in other presentations. So, and more cringeworthy photos there. Big cracks, nothing good gonna come of that tree. Same here. So rather than dwelling on these as discussion, let's open it up to questions, and maybe you could go ahead and start putting in your CEU information in the chat like usual. And there's my black locust with the codominant stems, the bark inclusion, the decay cavity with the possum family inside. Kind of the perfect storm.
Possums need somewhere to live.
You bet. Questions, comments?
Dr. Kim Coder last week was talking about asymmetry in a tree as a problem. Well, he's mostly talking about storms, but they're more likely to fail if they're asymmetrical rather than symmetrical.
Yeah.
Pruning.
But Mariana, that also, so I guess it's a good thing to have a discussion about what symmetrical is in a tree. Because like Graham talked about in pruning, our goal isn't, to make every decurrent tree look like an excurrent growth. It's just a matter of having a balanced canopy is what I would define symmetrical as in that form, not necessarily like a straight leader and then, you know, all of these horizontal branches going off the side. Like that's not the goal that we are reaching or trying to reach as far as, but yes. So what you're saying, I agree, but take it to the next step of identifying what those terms mean in that context.
Yeah, why is the canopy unbalanced? Is the tree leaning? If it's leaning, is it reaching for sunlight and it's always been leaning? Then that may have less implications, even though it's imbalanced. The tree has been growing response wood to that lean throughout its whole life, compared to a tree that's been trenched on one side and it's beginning to lean more recently. That's more of a failure. They're both worth monitoring, but they have different implications for how likely the failure is to occur. And then, as you mentioned, Mariana, that wind event, that that weather that we can't predict, acting on the tree could make a tree that has a pretty unproblematic lean to it all of a sudden fail, when if that extra little bit hadn't been added to the forces involved, then it may not have failed otherwise. But yeah, that's good. That's worth mentioning. Kim Coder's been in the industry a long time and contributed a lot of great information on how we look at this stuff, for sure. What else? What other thoughts you guys have, or anything you want to share with the group or ask about? How about terminology from the book? You know, as I go back to chapter 12 and just kind of breeze through the key terms to see if there's anything I didn't talk about. You know, there are different levels of assessments. I don't think that's something ISA tests over, again, because it gets into track specifically. Sapwood rot versus heartwood rot, those are worth distinguishing. Sapwood rot is, as the name implies, where we have decay in the live tissue of the tree. This is really the factor that's making trees that are infested with EAB really brittle and dangerous to climb in when the infestation is in a later stage. Heartwood rot is really just taking out structural wood from the inside of the tree, and the tree is going to be generally better at preventing that decay from spreading into the new wood. So that shell thickness is more likely to develop sufficiently than if we have a compromise to the sapwood, the living tissue that's not only moving, you know, all the photosynthates and the water and stuff that the tree needs, but it's also compromising decay from, you know, the ability of the tree to prevent that decay from moving throughout the other live tissue.
Yeah, in the sapwood, you have actively growing cells which can perform, you know, the compartmentalization. But in the center, it's dead material that is just providing kind of the bones for the tree. And so you're not going to have a lot of compartmentalization if the middle of a tree, like cottonwoods, start rotting out, or even hackberries, some maples.
Mm-hmm. Now there is I never correct anybody when they say the inside of the tree is dead. There are
Right.
there are parenchyma that move throughout, you know, the same way I talk about the roots growing like wagon wheel spokes. The parenchyma radiate from the center of the tree out, and there are living cells that permeate that parenchyma that's inside the heartwood as well. But generally, that heartwood is inert and mostly just structural for the tree, and not doing a lot of energy storage or moving water or nutrients or anything like that. But the parenchyma is where you get those epicormic sprouts. So when you stub a tree off, you top it. That parenchymal tissue is what's going to manifest that bud that you never saw before, and now you have a sprout coming out where there was no indication that there would ever be one. Cool. Anybody else got anything? This is a fun topic. So please, if you haven't already, let me know if you want to participate in a track training, and I'll be sure to keep you in the loop as that develops.
Perfect.
All right.
That is all we have for today. Again, next time we're going to go over chapter 13, urban forests. So you can look through that. Again, get started on your reading of chapters 15 and 16. So that way you have an idea of what topics you would like to discuss further next week.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We will leave the Zoom window open another minute or two so you can get your CEU stuff in if you haven't already. Yep, thanks, Lance. We'll see you Thursday. Yeah, Deanna, I've got you on my list.
I said that wrong. Chapter 14 next time. Deanna, Graham is the one that's putting the ISA numbers and sending those. So we'll have to just look back and make sure that you've been on those. I can.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah,
reports.
okay. And
see
sometimes they've
Michael.
come in under Michael Albanese because I've used his computer in the evening. So if you see Michael instead of my name, it's
Okay.
really me. Yeah.
Yeah, no
Don't
worries.
give him any credit.
Those will just vanish into the ether.
Yeah, no kidding.
I don't remember any sheets that didn't have your name on them. So yeah,
Okay.
you should be good to go there.
Awesome.
And you'll have
Okay.
gobs of CEUs by the time you're done with this, plus the.
Oh my gosh, yes. And then I've been in the one, so the person that said I can't remember who said something about the Durango. I was in that as well. And it was a great discussion. It almost came across anti-tree, and it caused a lot of, okay, this is what trees can do, and this is the damage, and this is the why, and look at your plumbing, and that kind of thing. But
Yeah.
so yeah, I was part of that discussion as well. It was really good though. She was a tree lover, but it was like the flip side of why we shouldn't plant trees.
Yeah. That's why I always want, when I make a statement like all trees are defective or at least potentially defective, I like to temper that with, let's talk about the probabilities and the likelihood of something actually.
Right.
So it's not fear mongering.
Exactly. No kidding.
Well,
Thank
and
you.
a lot of times people think about, just the tree and not, all of the parts of the management as being a part of that equation as far as like what the outcome of, a terrible storm like that, can be.
They lost 8,000 trees. It was amazing in a short area. I mean,
Would have been
most of
really
that,
interesting. I wonder if anybody did like a study on that to see like how much, like what was the age diversity and what was like the general species of like what they lost. Cause that would be really interesting to know. Like, was it all old trees that, were reaching the
no,
span,
yeah.
or was it just all ages and all species?
It was pretty much all. I'm sure I don't know if there was a specific study yet because it wasn't that long ago, right? But and a lot of the conference was on weather and the difference with tornadoes and what a derecho is and how it's wind at tornado speed for an hour.
Right.
I mean, it was a whole 45,
Right.
50 some minutes for Rapid City, I think. And yeah, so it was a great conference though. I mean, because of that because of that reason. That topic was unique for a lot of us, at least for me.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
The other
it was-
question I would want to look at, like the other part of like a study like that is like how many of them are in irrigated lawns?
Right. Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Well,
like, I don't
Yeah.
know. Because I mean, okay, so like Cozad is known for not having amazing soil. And
Mm-hmm.
they also, in some of our straight line winds, they had quite a few that lifted and uprooted. And it's just that their soil is not conducive for like deep rooting or having a lot of anchor roots, because the roots, the plate stays much closer to the surface.
Sure.
And so
Sure.
then when they do get that wind, so maybe like, I don't know, there's a lot of questions I would have to that.
Yeah.
Sure.
I
That study would be good, but a lot of the frames that were shown really showed old, mature roots, huge, that were just out. The one frame that you show, Graham, they were all like that. I mean, it was like people's yards and
Yeah.
farmland, and for that area, I don't know that much could have withstood with
Right.
this, could withstand that.
Yeah.
Thank you, you guys.
You
Thanks
bet.
thanks for everything. This has been really good.
No problem. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
Oh, yeah.
The
All
other
right.
cool research that I have seen is nationwide, they did a look at, they investigated communities that had significant weather events, and they found a really strong correlation between tree failure and sidewalk repair in the last 5 years.
Oh, get with our counselor.
So it gets back to that root disturbance and
Right.
Yes,
all that. So,
exactly. Sure.
Um,
Wow.
Right.
All
I
right. Well,
would
I'll
s-
see you on Thursday.
yep.
I would still scream plant trees.
I know,
Yeah.
me too. Yeah. Even the woman that presented, she was like, I'm a tree lover. I really am. But she had to keep saying it every like 3
Right.
minutes, because
Oh, good.
her frames did not come across like that. But it's
Yeah.
it was good for a conference, because we don't hear that. I mean, we don't really talk too much about, hey, watch this family that, so of course the benefit far outweighs that risk, I think, but
Yeah.
we don't have a whole hour's worth of why you shouldn't plant a tree.
Right.
John, did
See
you
you
have,
Thursday.
yeah,
Right.
you too, Deanna. John,
Okay.
did you have something?
I was just going to say that I put down for everyone, put me on the list for risk assessment.
Okay.
And I was
Very
just
good.
going to type up one to you, but
Okay.
I got through. Okay. See you
You bet.
Thursday.
All right. Take
Um,
care, John.
Perfect. Okay. Well, we'll see everybody on Thursday.
I'm going to put something in the chat here so that I've got about John.
Okay.
Just so I don't forget.
Perfect. All right. See you, everybody.
Bye, guys.
Bye.